watching Beyond Market. Welcome. I'm Esther Awuni. Many thanks for joining us. On today's show, we'll assess women's financial inclusion in Nigeria as a new report focuses on the drivers of gender gap and financial exclusion. You can join the conversation on social media. Let me know what you think about the topics we discuss, and to do so, you can use the hashtag Beyond Market. You can send me a message on Twitter to my Twitter handle. It's at Esther O. Awuni. A recent report by the Central Bank of Nigeria and EFINA found that lack of income, education, and low trust in financial service providers are the most important drivers of financial exclusion for both men and women. Now, the report further notes that although gender is not a driver of exclusion, the core drivers of exclusion tend to be highly gendered. Immanuel, Head of Programmes at EFINA, joins me now for more insight into this report. Ashley, thank you so much. Pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thank you. Thanks for, very happy to be here.
Quite a thorough report, but before we go into it, because I've had EFINA here a couple of times and in the last couple of years, and we've been tracking the progress of financial inclusion in Nigeria as a whole. Sure. We have a 2020 target, but then we're in 2020 already. But let's talk about where we are right now and the kind of progress that we've made so far.
Sure. So EFINA has been measuring financial inclusion in Nigeria since 2008. And we do nationally representative surveys every 2 years where we go out and we ask people, what financial services are you using, so that we can actually get an accurate measurement of inclusion overall. And so since 2008, we've seen that we've certainly been making progress. So about 27 million additional Nigerian adults are using formal financial services like banks or microfinance banks or things like that. And we've seen the percentage of excluded adults go down. But that being said, we still have a ways to go. So the last time we measured in 2018, we still had over 36% of Nigerian adults being financially excluded. And the target for 2020 is to get that down to 20% excluded or 80% included. Okay. So we'll measure again this year, but we still have some work to do.
But what would you say have been some of the bumps in the road so far, and how we've been able to, while progressing, also addressing those challenges at the same time?
Sure, yeah, there are a lot of challenges. So I think that what EFINA has sort of partnered with regulators in the industry to do was, first of all, just even get financial inclusion on the radar of everybody. So we supported the central bank in creating a national financial inclusion strategy, partnered on the central bank, and other regulators have, over the years, been putting in place some regulatory changes, because one of the challenges before was that the regulation wasn't always well suited to people who were in the most excluded demographic. So for example, if you need certain kinds of identification to open a bank account or proof of address, a lot of Nigerians don't have that. So the central bank issued tiered Know Your Customer, KYC regulations, which allows people without ID to open a low-value bank account, things like that. So some of those hurdles or barriers have been addressed over time. We still have a lot of challenges. So some of the challenges are really just kind of creating a business case for serving the most excluded people. So historically, the financial sector has been better at addressing sort of middle to higher income Nigerian adults. So we require a lot of actors to come together and be really innovative in figuring out how can they serve the low-income population and still be profitable while doing that. I
thought when fintechs came onto the scene, they were meant to, they came with the innovation, and it was sort of game-changing for the space. But to what extent would you say that has helped in addressing some of those barriers or hurdles?
Sure. I think the fintechs have started to help. It's still, and so we've seen some progress. The fintechs both have helped have potential, we think, for bringing more excluded people into the system, and then also the people who are already using financial services by providing them with more sort of value or more services. So for example, about 40% of Nigerians now are banked, but most of those do not use banks for credit, right? So they might have savings accounts, they might use a bank to transfer money to somebody, but when Nigerians borrow, they still mostly borrow from family or friends, sometimes from informal, like money lender or things like that. So the fintechs, one example is fintechs have the potential to extend credit to some of the people who didn't have access before, although we are trying to work with them to make sure that they do it responsibly in a safe way.
But on the whole, as far as awareness is concerned, would you say that, especially in the informal sector, in the rural areas where obviously this is much, very much needed, would you say that we've made good progress in at least spreading the word and allowing people in those areas to understand the value of being financially included, just having access to bank accounts, credits, all of that? Would you say that we've done a good job in creating a good level of awareness?
I think it's probably sort of mixed. And to be honest with you, I actually think, because a lot of times we have conversations with people and they say, oh, we need to make people aware about financial services or the benefit of savings. But if you make somebody aware of financial services and they have no way to access it, sort of what's the point, right? And evidence globally sort of shows that the best time to educate somebody about financial services is sort of right at the moment when they have an opportunity to use it. Right. So either at the time that the service is available to them or at kind of the right stage in their life when they might need a certain product or service. So I also think that we have to think about awareness, but we need to think about at the same time, are we developing like relevant and affordable financial services that can reach people? So if somebody's in a rural area where we see that rural adults are more likely to be excluded, we can do an awareness campaign, but we also need to maybe think about how do we get agents in that community, for example? How do we get an affordable product that people are actually going to want to use that meets their needs?
Speaking about agent, there has been there's an agent network already. I know that I'm not sure about the number, maybe 500 or so. I'm not sure of the number, but that was said, because I remember I had those conversations last year too, and was sort of said to be a game changer also. I mean, they're closest to people. Yeah,
exactly. So we absolutely believe that widespread agent networks are going to be critical to really increasing financial inclusion in Nigeria, because we know that kind of from a business case point of view and just logistically, it doesn't make sense to have a bank branch in every village, right? So the challenge has been how do we get agents out into the various communities that they need to be in? And there's been, so the central bank has put in place some enabling regulations. Various partners have come in to try to kind of build out their agent networks. I think there's still some work that can be done in terms of making sure that those agents, we've kind of got the right business case for expanding those agents, especially to the most rural areas where they might not have, as many transactions, or people might not have the same value, like higher value of transactions.
Absolutely. Let's get right to this report now. Sure. And this report set out to identify the causes of gender gap in financial inclusion, and of course specifically looking at the women who have that higher number of financial exclusion. Talk to us about the questions, the core questions that this study set out to answer.
Sure. So I was saying that EFINA measures financial inclusion nationwide every 2 years, and what we had been seeing between 2008 and 2018, which was our most recent nationwide survey, we've seen financial inclusion overall grow, but what we've seen is that every time we measure, there's a persistent gender gap. So men are always more included than women. And in terms of that gender gap, we haven't been seeing it go down, right? So women's financial inclusion has increased, but men's financial inclusion has also been increasing. So part of the reason we did this study is we wanted to understand why is that? And really, more importantly, how do we address kind of what are the underlying sort of drivers of that gender gap? And then what are the opportunities for addressing them?
Okay, so I have a couple of the questions here. For instance, the financial needs and ambitions of excluded women, what can be done to improve women's access to and the use of financial services in Nigeria, particularly women in the rural areas and perhaps in some key parts of the country where it's even harder, even though they're in the rural areas. So, what answers did you provide in this report in terms of, because I remember I mentioned at the top of the show, perhaps financial service providers, perhaps a lack of trust, low levels of education, etc. But could you just expand on those points?
Sure. Yeah, so I think in terms of, just to kind of summarize the key findings, So we did, in this research, we did another nationally representative survey and then some deep dive research with women in communities in a few locations. And on the nationally representative data, did some rigorous analysis to understand, okay, what are the key drivers related to exclusion if you hold everything else equal? And as you mentioned, the 3 factors that emerged for both women and for men, actually, in terms of being related to exclusion were low levels of income, low levels of education, and then low levels of trust, basically, in financial service providers. And that was measured by, we asked people, which financial service provider do you trust the most? And some people would list a bank, some people would list like a cooperative or a susu. Some people would say, I don't trust any financial service providers. And so if you kind of take that data and analyze it as those who trust and those who don't trust, you'll see those who don't trust are highly correlated with those who are excluded. But we also found that if we look just at formal financial services, and formal is regulated, so like a bank or a microfinance bank or mobile money or something like that, gender is also an independently significant factor, meaning that women are, even when you hold everything else equal, women are less likely than men to use formal financial services. So that tells us also that there's an underlying gender factor, that the formal financial system in Nigeria really needs to be, is not meeting women's needs or reaching women effectively, and we need to think about that.
It's quite interesting to know that, excuse me, it's the same factors that hinder both men and women, but women have lower numbers. I'm trying to crack that code.
Sure, so let me explain that first piece. So women, just because of kind of many reasons in Nigeria, women tend to have lower levels of education in Nigeria. Women tend to have lower levels of income in Nigeria. And women are less likely to say that they trust financial service providers. So on those kind of factors of income, education, and trust, because women are less likely to have as many years of formal education, that's sort of driving them toward being more excluded. So this really highlights, kind of on that point, this highlights the need for all Nigerians to think about how are we addressing those underlying barriers. And we've known, educating girls is a solution to many, many problems that we face in Nigeria. So this is just sort of evidence that it will help us address one more problem.
Absolutely. If you're just joining us, Ashley Immanuel, the Head of Programmes at EFINA, is our guest today on the show, and we've been assessing women's financial inclusion in Nigeria. Thank you, Ashley, for your time so far. Let's pick up from where we left off. We've identified some of the issues: lack of trust in financial service providers, low levels of education for women, and same factors affecting men and women, but like you said, for some reason, it's affecting women more. With these key findings now, what are the next steps in terms of, now we know what the issues are, can there be a policy response? Do we need to tweak the national financial inclusion strategy? What more can we do in response to these underlying problems?
Sure, and I'll say the National Financial Inclusion Strategy was refreshed late 2018. So, I think has identified some next steps that are encouraging for promoting financial inclusion generally, including for women. I think that there are a few things. So in terms of policy, we're actually working with the Financial Inclusion Secretariat, who was the co-author on this research, to put in place a framework for advancing women's financial inclusion. So we'll be doing that over the next few months, and that is intended to identify specific actions that the central bank and other regulators and other partners can take to promote women's financial inclusion. I would say that generally some of the things that came out of this research were that, some of the, so to some degree, what would promote women's financial inclusion are the same things that promote financial inclusion overall. So in terms of policy and regulation, we need to think about, are we creating the right environment that provides a good business case for reaching excluded people? So for agents, for example, can they transact profitably? And that means looking at regulations in terms of regulatory requirements, like caps on what fees agents can charge, which the central bank is currently actually looking at. Looking at just other fees and charges in the financial system.
Are those issues or those responses that could perhaps immediately address and take the numbers?
Yes.
Address, maybe like low-hanging fruit, for
exactly.
lack of a better term.
Yeah. So I think that there are a few specific changes like maybe removing some of the price caps on agent fees, I think would probably have a pretty rapid impact in terms of more agents being deployed. There are also some things like looking at who can provide services in a cost-effective way to financially excluded, kind of trying different business models. So for example, the Central Bank of Nigeria issued regulations for payment service banks a little more than a year ago, and has started to issue the first approval in principles ahead of licenses. So we, as EFINA, feel hopeful that having more licensed payment service banks who can go out and try a different business model is an important kind of avenue to try for driving financial inclusion. And part of the mandate of payment service banks is actually reaching excluded groups and areas. So continuing to kind of progress down that path and issue more licenses, we feel is a way that that's kind of likely to drive financial inclusion overall for men and for women. But then I think for women's financial inclusion specifically, I think sort of a recommendation for the entire industry really is just even bringing gender awareness into the picture is a start. Because historically, I think when the financial sector kind of globally was developed, it was developed geared toward men, intentionally or unintentionally. Okay. You know, that's kind of who had money, and that's who was working, and that's who was working inside banks. It was mostly men. And you just sort of end up with a system that maybe serves men a little bit better. So just even taking a conscious reflection, let's say that I'm a financial service provider. For me, thinking about kind of end-to-end women specifically as a target customer segment when I'm designing a product, when I'm thinking about, okay, how do I reach a woman? You know, does she have, you know, women tend to be more time poor. They also tend to have more restricted mobility. So if a woman if it's harder for her to leave her home or her market stall, and she doesn't have the time to be, you know, taking a 30-minute, 1-hour bike ride to go to a bank branch, for example, how do I maybe create an agent network to reach her? Maybe there's some evidence globally that shows that female agents can reach women as customers better. So how do I kind of design my agent network, maybe recruit more women to reach women? Even in things like advertising. Sometimes you'll look at adverts and it's mostly men that you see in the images using financial services. So how do we communicate the kind of message of women as customers?
It appears to me like there needs to be that broad mindset
exactly.
change also.
Exactly.
I mean, it doesn't just affect financial inclusion or even the financial sector. It's, you know, it's across sectors. But I mean, working on this project, and even before now, what kind of response do you usually get when you're making conversations and saying, you know, we want an agent, we want the financial sector to go in this certain direction because of women, you know, tailoring it, you know, bringing it down to that nitty specific, you know, gender issue. We want you to go in this direction specifically because we are trying to address a gender gap. I mean, what's been the feedback? Is it usually a positive response that, you know, like, oh, okay, that's true, we do need to include women, or one of, you know, it's just a general rule, if it affects women negatively, well, we're sorry, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think that generally we see a lot of positive feedback in terms of the intent to include women. When we were doing this research, some providers, you know, will say, you know, if they're being honest, they don't see a business case for serving financially excluded women. And that comes back to some of the things I was saying about, okay, well, how do we create a better business case, right? So how do we maybe change some of the regulations to change the fee structures? How do we work as an industry to be a little bit innovative and creative in reaching them? Alongside addressing some of the other underlying issues like education and income. But I'll say that generally, for all of the conversations that I've had with providers and other partners, there's a very strong interest in reaching women more effectively, and where we tend to partner with them is just a little bit more on the how. So sometimes, if, for example, if I talk to I've had a few conversations with banks who are running agent networks, and I asked them, do you even track the gender of your agents? And a lot of them say yes, and then I say, do you ever analyze the data? And they usually say no. But if they did a little bit of analysis with their own data, or if they kind of used other research like this research, they might find insights that could help them reach women more effectively.
Speaking about data, do you think it could help if there was also data to show the kind of progress that can be achieved if women, if providers, if financial service providers were more innovative in perhaps in the kind of products that they bring up for women? Perhaps when they see the numbers, they might be convinced that, okay, fine, this does, the statistics, there's numbers to back this up, so we should put more effort and more energy into, like you said, analyzing, like for the female agents and all of. I'm just wondering.
Sure, yeah. I think, and I mean, you're right, because the numbers are there, kind of demographics. We've got, about 50 million adult women in Nigeria, so it's a huge market. And, over 30 million of those are not using banks. So there's a huge kind of addressable additional market that banks could reach and other formal providers. I think that, and in terms of data, we've also seen that there is positive impact of women using financial services. So things like women who have access to formal financial services are more likely to have more decision-making power in the household. They're more likely to, there's some kind of positive correlation with formal employment and things like that. So I think that there's broad data in terms of the addressable market, and I think that there's some data showing the potential impact also of reaching women.
Just some action,
it's just kind of how do you do it?
How do you?
And I think that's where maybe in Nigeria we get a little bit more stuck, and that's where EFINA is trying to partner as much as we can with the financial services industry to now kind of help providers and regulators and others think about, okay, now how do we actually reach this group of women that we're trying to reach?
Well, what are you hopeful for 2020 with the results and the findings of this report? Quite eye-opening here. And of course, you're working with more partners. You're working with the regulator, the Central Bank of Nigeria. I'm just what are you hopeful for, perhaps to achieve in 2020, and how you see this also feeding into the overall success of the overall financial inclusion drive. We're already in 2020, and according to the report, doesn't look like we're going to meet our target of 80%. But I'm just wondering if some of these action points are put into implemented, perhaps that could push us further.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So we'll never reach our nationwide targets if we're not reaching women, because women are half of the population. So absolutely, I think. For me, kind of a realistic goal for the year, I'd like to kind of get gender and women's financial inclusion more in the conversation, kind of at least get to a place where, as a financial service industry, we're generally kind of more aware of issues related to women's financial inclusion and how do we address the gender gap. Building out this framework for advancing women's financial inclusion will also highlight a few specifics. I think that also, if we see regulators continue to kind of drive toward those targets, for example, the central bank issuing more payment service bank licenses and things like that, we think that that'll help accelerate progress toward those targets. So even if and we'll measure again this year, even if we don't hit the target for 2020, if we can at least accelerate our progress, then for the next time we measure in 2022, I would be optimistic about being able to see that major change that we've really been looking for.
But when you look at the space in general, what is that one thing that encourages you the most in terms, perhaps obviously from a progress side of things? What is that one thing that's happening right now within the space that encourages you?
Yeah, I think that there's a kind of real spirit of partnership and innovation. So I think, earlier you were asking about fintech, and EFINA has been sort of increasingly working with the fintech sector, and we're doing some additional research actually on fintech to identify specific opportunities for fintech to drive financial inclusion. So I think, and we've seen from the regulators also, I think a pretty positive attitude toward trying to strike that right. There's a balance they have to strike, right? They want to support innovation, but they also have a responsibility for protecting consumers and the financial system. And I think that the regulators have signaled really strong intent to do that. And we are kind of partnering with both sides to try to create a system where we can generate that innovation that will really kind of be a breakthrough for the market.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Ashley, for talking to us today. And of course, all the best and hoping for better numbers next time you're in the studio with us.
Absolutely.
We've been speaking to Ashley Immanuel. She's the head of programs at EFINA. That's it on Beyond Markets. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Remember, you can watch the show at 5 p.m. West African time daily and have access to all previous episodes of the show on our website at cnbcafrica.com. You can also stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Markets, and of course, you can send your thoughts and your comments to my Twitter handle too. It's at Esther O. Awuni. For myself and the team, it's bye for now.